Welcome to iPad Pros, the show all about using your iPad to be productive and get work done. I'm Tim Chen, host of the show.
Yeah, keyboard shortcut, so Command O to open is basically at any point, if you hit Command O, whatever you have selected will be opened in a new window. There is drag and drop on iPad. Yeah, you can drag a note or a project or a related note, anything, basically everywhere where you see a note in the UI, you can pick it up and just drag it to the side of the screen and it becomes a new window as well.
Welcome back to another episode of iPad Pros. I'm really excited in this episode to be joined by Alex, the founder and co-owner of Agenda. Agenda is one of my favorite note-taking apps that really thoughtfully integrates with your calendar. And in this episode, we dive into their latest update, Agenda 17, which brings multiple window support to both the iPad and the Mac. And there was a lot to dive into here. The window support was really well thought out, and I'm really just excited to dive deep with Alex into all of the updates found with Agenda 17 and some of the previous updates. Before we dive into the episode, I want to remind everyone you can support this podcast over at patreon.com/iPadPros or by subscribing in Apple Podcasts. And with that, here's my interview with Alex. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to be there.
Absolutely. Yeah, your partner Drew was on a while back, episode 48 in April of 2019. So there's been a lot of updates to Agenda, which you're a big part of. You're one of two people on that team. So welcome.
Yeah, you spoke to everybody. It's me and Drew.
Yeah. So two main topics today. Agenda 17 came out very recently here, and Stage Manager is kind of a part of why that app on iPad works as well as it does. Because it's all about multi-windows, and you can do split screen now, which is great, but Stage Manager really makes Agenda 17 shine. So we'll talk about all that. But before we get to that, I just want to ask, what's your current kind of iPad setup and what role the iPad has for you kind of day to day?
I've got a few iPads, and I have to be honest, it's more because I'm fighting to get them out of the hands of my kids. They always get annoyed when I get close to a release because Dad needs to test more. So, it's a combination of things, and most of them are 14 inch or 11 inch iPads with a keyboard, smart keyboard. I used various ones. I've got this M1 iPad, obviously, to test for Stage Manager well, and then I've got a few other ones as well. But there's mostly for testing purposes. For Agenda,
excellent.
That's mainly. And my wife is an artist, and she uses a larger iPad for drawing mainly, and so that's another one that we have in the house. So
nice,
I'll just tend to switch,
And then the Apple Pencil with them to make, because Agenda does do some cool stuff there with that.
Yeah.
And do you have any favorite iPad apps outside of Agenda, of course?
Well, I like playing around with the pencil, I should say. So Procreate is a favorite, and my wife's using that a lot for her drawings. And that's basically also the story, I guess, for me and the iPad. Mm-hmm. I like the iPad for consuming more than actually so hard work, because most of the day I'm behind my Mac, so I'll use a Mac.
Right, because you can't yet build Agenda from an iPad with with Swift Playgrounds. That won't quite work in there.
Exactly. No, that's a bit a step too far, I think. And no, but I use it as a device where it's nice to sit on the couch, be lightweight. Effectively, it's for me, it's very much that lightweight experience, and it's great for consuming media. It's great for drawing with a pencil. It's very hands-on because you touch the device really literally, right? So,
exactly.
That's what I like about the iPad.
Yeah. So for those that aren't familiar with Agenda, I don't know who you are out there, but there are people, I'm sure still. Can you give me the elevator pitch on what this app is and who it's for?
Yeah, Agenda is a note-taking app, and I guess the unique thing about it is that it seamlessly integrates with your calendar and with dates in general. So that's also its point. It's most notes certainly in a professional or serious hobby environment or study environment have to do with dates in some way or form. So events and dates. So pertaining to a meeting or to a certain project where you have deadlines and plans. And so all your notes relate to some dates usually, and that's what Agenda is really taking to the front. I mean that's what it's all about. It's assigning dates and events to your notes, pretty much.
Excellent. Yeah. And it's super smart in that way. Like if you have a meeting coming up, you can assign it to that meeting or, a podcast interview in my case. And yeah.
Exactly. And you see your calendar on the side. And so it's really for people to take notes in a more professional environment or doing serious hobbies. But it works as a generic note-taking as well. So it's great for people at work, but also, creatives, students, everybody that takes notes in a more serious way.
Yeah. What are some of the ways you personally use Agenda?
I built, Drew and I, we built the app for ourselves. And so we're also both using it for everything really, and so I use it literally for everything for when it comes to note taking. So I keep track of very practically what we're going to do with Agenda, all the ideas I have about the app. I track the releases with it. When I we have a YouTube channel, so when I get ideas and the scripts, I write them in Agenda. But also all the other meetings I have, everything pretty much from lists to what I have to take on travel to literally very hardcore Agenda bug tracking almost.
Yeah. So before we get to Agenda 17, I wanted to just ask and touch on, do you have any favorite updates from the past couple of years to Agenda? Like what have been the features you and Drew have added that you continue to be delighted with and use day in and day out as like, oh, I'm so glad we did that in version whatever back.
Yeah, I guess the personal, one of my personal favorite is the open quickly feature. So you press Option space and you get a quick way to quickly find your notes, and from that we kind of develop these actions that we call them. So that's really more of a power user, but you type a / character and then it starts auto-completing, and it has not only just auto-completion of tags and people, but also actions really. So you can say, I want to, one that I always use is a sort. So a / sort, and it puts all these checked off items to the bottom. And, that's an example of the ones I use a lot. And so, it's a power feature, but I think it's one that I use personally a lot, and I like the way it ended up being. It's that's what I like. You have some ideas and something that can be unique to your app and could work well, and if it then comes out that way and you see people liking it a lot, it's really cool to see.
Yeah, back in the Mac days for me in college, I remember Quicksilver. And it reminds me of a lot of the power you can get out of just using your keyboard to just type a few things and you're there and doing it.
Exactly. That's exactly the idea.
Yeah. So Agenda 17, the big addition here is true multi-window support on the iPad as well as the Mac. So first off, congrats on this big change to Agenda. So what are were the goals in supporting multi-window? Because it seems like, you could just kind of throw it in there, but it seems like you guys thought it through a bit more than just like, let's throw it in there.
Yeah, I mean, Agenda is like I mentioned that in the we always make a video around the releases now, and so one of the things I started this video is saying like, look, Agenda is a single window app, and that's still true. I mean, we're not switching to text edits like just open a note with every window with every of your notes. So the philosophy is still that's the basics because it works so well, and we've not had multiple window support for a long time, and we started with this shoebox of all your notes and everything is in one window, and that's still the basis. But there are simply cases where it's just really nice to have a note in a window, and especially like the call we have now, to have your notes there and not have this large window, but just have it on the side, either to look at your notes or to keep notes. That's a classic example. Or when you have, you're reorganizing things or you're comparing things, that's when it makes sense to not have to switch all the time, because that's the downside of a single window app. So the philosophy was, it's something I certainly also always wanted, because you have a lot of calls or meetings and video calls especially, where it's just super useful to have your notes next to the video chat and be able to quickly add them. So that was one of the use cases, but it was always with the philosophy of, okay, there will be times when you open a note in a separate window, but most of the time you will just work it still in that single window mode. So it was definitely not a kind of let's turn this all around. It's more like in certain cases it's easy to open a note in a window, and then it should also be fast. You should quickly be able to open this note that I'm looking at in a separate window, so you can take it somewhere or place it somewhere, almost like a placeholder. And so that was the philosophy in the design as well.
Okay, yeah. And what does it mean for Agenda on iPad? Does it mean you mentioned Agenda is like a single window app, or initially designed that way? It's the full user interface, like in kind of what kind of new interactions are possible with this update, having Agenda in multiple places?
Yeah, so on iPad it's slightly different, because like you say, I mean, it's a subtle difference that you only, in a way I usually pick one of the two platforms to start building the feature. In this case I picked the Mac as the first one. And that's where I felt it made sense to keep this single window that's always there, and then you open notes in several other windows next to it.
Right.
But you would always kind of go back to this one main window, as we call it, right? So
because on the Mac you'll have 10 overlapping windows, and
exactly.
It's a
and
different
then I
experience.
moved to the iPad and I started kind of implementing it the same way. So you would have a kind of on the iPad it's called scenes, but it's effectively kind of windows. And I would have this main scene, and you would try to come back to it, but very kind of quickly I noticed that this didn't work well on the iPad, because it's not designed that way. And you can talk about the benefits and the downsides, but it's simply, I noticed I was just fighting the system, because you would have to kind of say, okay, now I would have to switch this other scene back in, and you would get this kind of big, large kind of back and forth switching of
because you could get stuck
scenes.
if you didn't have the full interface in certain places. You'd be like, oh,
yes,
crap,
exactly.
now I need to close it. Yeah.
Exactly, because the way the agenda window works, it's we have on the left we have this sidebar where you pick your projects, and in the middle you have your notes, and then on the right side you have your calendar and your related notes and other items. So that's the main window, and those two left and right bars you can close and open, right? So on the Mac it works that only the main window has those bars on the side,
right,
and you have these kind of lightweight windows, which is just the note, and that's it. And you can't say, open those sidebars again. And that works okay on a Mac because it's so, the way it works. But on iPad, you would have to kind of modally switch back to this main window, and it's a big transition and very in your face, and that just didn't work well. So instead, on the iPad, every window and every scene has these sidebars.
Yeah.
So the full app is there in every window, basically.
Yeah.
And there's no distinction between a window that is like the main one and kind of more auxiliary or additional windows. Every window is the same. The only thing that we do is that we are a bit more clever to, when you open a note in a window, to then hide those sidebars. So it feels a little bit the same way, but at least from every window you can again make it look the same as the main window if you wanted to, and you can navigate without having to go back and have these large transitions all the time.
Yeah, and it reminds me a bit of focus mode where you're opening a note in a new window, and it is the full app, but you're hiding everything else. So whether it be a note, a search query, whatever it is, you're just like focusing in on that content for the main window. And then if you want to, you can then access everything else. But to start, at least it's focusing in on what you want to focus on.
Exactly.
For
So
that window.
when you spawn a new window, so to speak, then it basically hides those bars. And so it feels that like you're focused on that single node. But if you would want to go from there to back to another node, you don't have to go back to the main window, which on the Mac obviously is just like a command tab or something to switch to the other window. But on iPad, that would be a large kind of like, where did I go now? Type transition. So you want to prevent those. Yeah. So on them, and that's the main difference on iPad. And then there is this kind of in-between thing that they came up with, which is like a kind of a window that floats above your other, but your main window. So for instance, in Mail, you can have your messages pop up in this kind of, in a floating window, above, where you still see the original content where you came from below it, right?
Yeah.
And so they introduced that as a kind of halfway state, and it's a bit, in that sense, also a little bit odd. But that's also what Agenda supports. Is if you open a node in first instance, it will actually make it float above it, and from there you can then decide, okay, I want to take this full screen, or I'm going to dismiss it again. So it brings you a little bit like into this halfway state where you can still decide to go back to where you were, or you say, no, I really want to focus on this one, and I'm gonna open it in a full screen mode, for instance.
How do you let's initiate the floating window on iPad?
So on every node has a button in the lower right corner that instantly allows you to open that node into a window. So what that button does is exactly open that node in this kind of floating state, which is almost like a focused mode. And from there you can take it further on into either full screen or split screen or slide over. You have all these variants that Apple introduced depending on the use case that you
Gotcha.
have.
Yeah, so that's the default, and then you can decide what to do with it at that point. That's smart. Yeah. And one question I have is, how does live updating work here? Say you have the same note in two windows in different stage managers, stages. How quickly would one node update on the other stage, and do you have to worry at all about that?
So we were lucky because we kind of built all that stuff already as part of the original Agenda, so I didn't have to do much there. The way it works, it updates upon a save effectively.
Okay.
So if I'm editing on one node, it will save every 5 seconds by default or something, and that will, the moment that the other window will also update. But we also added some more kind of cues. So if I deselect the node, that's a trigger to update. If I go to a different scene, we always enforce a save also to make sure that your data is saved automatically in case, the app quits or is pushed out of memory or whatever. So in those moments, it will always feel faster in that way. So usually what happens is when you anyway switch to a different window, you'd either deselect a node, and that's also when you expect kind of the data to be in sync. So the short answer is not on every keystroke, but on every save.
Gotcha. Yeah. And it's a funny thing, saves, I remember back in my Mac days, like it was like you save, but on the iPad just kind of automatic, and it's smart in that way.
Yeah. Well, it's one of these things where I'm not sure by heart if we did that on iPad, but I think on Mac people at some point even they expect you to, there's such a routine of Command S that we actually do that too. We use that as a trigger to reinforce a save at that moment. But anyway, that would be. I don't think I've added a shortcut on iPad actually.
Yeah. So you mentioned the button on every window to open that node in a new window. What are some of the other ways you can engage a new window? I know you can just be dragging stuff from various places, and there's different ways.
Keyboard shortcut. So Command O to open is basically at any point, if you hit Command O, whatever you have selected will be opened in a new window. There is a drag and drop on iPad. Yeah, you can drag a note or a project or a related note, anything. Basically, everywhere where you see a note in the UI, you can pick it up and just drag it to the side of the screen, and it becomes a new window as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I really liked was the related notes. There was a little link, and I could just pop that link over, and it opened a brand new window from that.
Yeah. That's also the idea that it's also, that's one of the nice things of adding this this multiple windows feature, is exactly that, is to also be able to in some way preview a note without losing where you were in the bigger picture, which is always, again, one of the downsides of this kind of shoebox app, is that you can just to go to another node, you might lose where you are. So we had already some kind of history type features in Agenda, but this makes it much easier.
Yeah. On the Mac, I could see a feature where you hit a keyboard shortcut if you're on a focus just one note to open all related notes in different windows. But on iPad, you have the 4-window limit, and you would bump up against that real quick.
And on the Mac, actually, if you hold the Alt Option key, and just hit anywhere where you see a note, that immediately opens it in the window as well.
Yeah.
And for technical reasons, that's a little bit harder to do on iPad, actually, if you would have a keyboard.
Right.
But then you naturally go more into drag and drop, or just use Command O to open something. But there's still some things where we can improve things there. Like some of those things.
Yeah, Commando is the one and only iPad keyboard shortcut as far as working with the Windows as outside of the system ones, of course, like Command W.
Yeah, we have some of the modifier keys that then enforce it to be, say, either, because by definition, but normally if I would say open a node and then a bit later open the same node again, it would reuse the window. It would be smart enough to say, you got that already open, and so if you hold the Shift key and Command, then it will enforce a new window. And so there's some of those shortcuts as well, to kind of enforce it to go into full screen mode instead of hovering mode. So this intermediate state, like the mail message type, what I just described. I think if you hold Control Command O, it will actually then really force it in a full screen window. So there's some of those even more kind of
nice
pro kind of keyboard shortcuts.
Yeah,
if you wish. Yeah.
What are some of the windows that people may not even think about, like search? Like if you have there's a set of notes that you pull up via search or tags, like what are some of the more unique ones outside of just like a folder or a single note?
One of that I like is, for instance, we have the tag browser, so you can see all the tags that you've used, and as an overview, and that you can now, for instance, nicely put either in a window or in a split view, for instance. You keep it next to your notes as a navigational tool, because if you select one, you can then basically have the other windows show the notes for those tags. But we also now have an option that you can actually then say select one or more of those tags and then actually say make a window from that. So you would see all the notes that have those tags, and then if you use that, for instance, very frequently, that overview as we call it, then you can even save that again into your sidebar. So it becomes kind of almost like a complete round trip where you start with the tag browser, you select a few tags, you make that into a window, and then you make the window into a sidebar item again.
Which, so that being in the sidebar, makes it super easy to come back to that as a new window.
Exactly. Yeah. So it becomes a circle.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
So, external monitor, what is that experience like with Agenda 17 on the iPad? I know I was probably one of the early beta testers that's like, I know Stage Manager is really buggy, but yeah, it's not working quite yet, and it is working now. So what's the experience like, and what kind of struggles did you have fighting against early versions of Stage Manager?
Oh, yeah, well, don't get me started on those. And still, it works now, but that's thanks to basically a hack. But that has to do with the way we deal with the keyboard. I'll get to that. But no, I mean, it works much better now. And also with the external monitor, it's actually very nice. I mean, it looks very clean, very it's nice as a developer. It's nice to see it that way, And I've got
it's fun. Like you have this huge agenda window. It's like, oh, this feels so nice. And
I have
cozy.
this studio display, the Apple Studio display, and if I connect it to my iPad and you put your agenda window there, it just looks amazing. Although, as a Mac user, I just can't fight the feeling that, okay, well, this is basically replicating the Mac effectively.
Exactly.
But it's very nice and neat, and it's certainly, if you're used to, say, an 11-inch iPad, then it's a whole new world effectively. So it's very nice. Yeah, it works well. And with Stage Manager, like we said, I mean, we had loads of troubles in the beginning of where it was just not working. And one of the things that we really had troubles with is we have a bar above the keyboard. That where you have functions like inserting attachments and all images and but also styling, so bold lists and what have you. And that keyboard bar in Stage Manager was just disappearing, and and then it becomes it just doesn't work well. And I think there were actually, in hindsight, two types of problems. One had to do with simply having multiple windows, because we didn't have multiple windows in Agenda.
Right.
But Stage Manager is kind of, even if your app doesn't support it, it's kind of faking introducing the concept of windows to your app. So that definitely played part of it. So if switching between Agenda windows, the keyboard would not follow where you were, etc. So that was a bit tricky, but that was resolved. And then we were still left where it worked everything in, 16.2.
Yeah.
And then it broke again in 16.3 because the bar just started disappearing again. And it's like, what's going on? And then actually, we filed a bug, but actually in Xcode, you have this nice view where you can inspect your view hierarchy, and you can turn it like one, at 45 degree angles, and then extract all those views, and you can nicely see. And lo and behold, I could exactly see Apple's view that we're putting a nice gray background in front of my keyboard bar. So, I've now, we had to introduce some hack that detects that, and then basically continuously tells that parent view to say, hey, turn your background off, please. Turn your background off. So that's what it's actually doing. And now it works brilliantly, but it's a bit of a shame that
that's wild.
Yeah, but it works, and it works very nicely then in Stage Manager. And again, you can see that's where the windowing mode really shines.
Yeah. So the Mac also got updated, multi-window support there. And that's kind of where this started, actually. So what abilities on the Mac are there that you just can't do on iPad, and you kind of wish one day the OS could change a bit to allow some of these interactions?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about how in full screen or in external monitor, right? When you use Agenda on iPad with an external screen, it just looks amazing. But then there's things that just as a Mac user, a heavy Mac user, just kind of annoys me, which is you can't just make the screen exactly like, just resize it like 20 pixels bigger. Right. It has to stick to standard sizes. Different,
yeah.
And then even the live resizing still feels extremely clunky. When you resize a window, it effectively feels like it becomes all blurry, and then it when you release, it will just snap to some and then kind of reload, because it will switch to a different, what Apple calls size classes. So this is not an iPhone, but now it's an iPad window. So that just feels clunky to me. And also the fact that you can't just drag the window, say,
Anywhere.
on top of another one.
Yeah.
But then it has to stay on the side of it instead of, and sometimes but then when you add a window, it suddenly does allow you to overlap. So that all still feels very kind of immature to me as something that the Mac has had for like 20 years or now. So.
Yes. Yeah. I really hope they allow us to do kind of infinite sizes of windows and not force.
Yeah,
the size classes kind of frustrate me at times. Yeah.
Yeah, and Drew and I have a lot of discussions about it, and it feels like it feels sometimes that the iPad had to reinvent the wheel unnecessarily because so for instance a cursor behavior.
That I think they nailed the cursor and it like morphing in the different things. It seems very smart. Yeah.
That's nice, but at the same time, especially also from programmer perspective, it's done in a way where you're like, why did it have to be all kind of conceptually completely different approach for something that just works really well? I mean, because you could just everything that the Mac does when it comes to cursor support, there's nothing that prevents you from just adding that morphing and that snapping behavior.
Yeah.
Right. But no, it has to be all different. And the same is with the windowing system. And what it feels like is that it was taken, a group of people looked at it and say, okay, that's all nice, but we don't need all of this, right? Right now. So let's just strip all out and make a simple version. And I think especially when it comes to Windows, you now see that you then, in the longer run, start hitting problems because now Apple starts to effectively add things and add things and add things until you're basically back to that complicated system that in the beginning you thought was way too over the top. And now they hit issues like, well, no, you can't actually just make the window that size. It has to be either that size or that size because our system doesn't work like that and was never designed to have, arbitrary sizes and everything. So I think this is where you see this kind of, it's an interesting kind of journey that they have to go through where they hit limits and it's a bit that ultimately gets you into a place where you wonder like, well, this was solved like so long ago for the Mac and it still feels that clunky on iPad. And these are the downsides of such a cycle effectively. Yeah. So it's an interesting thing to see. And that's also certain things, especially for us where you see where it's so contrasting because you make the same app on two platforms. Right. You can see things where you're like, well, it's missing pieces where I really hope they will address them. I mean, especially as a developer, we get so little insight in certain things. Like I can't actually ask the system, hey, am I now in full screen mode? Am I in split view mode? Am I in hovering window mode?
Doing,
And that's a shame because on the Mac I have various things like. If I open a note in a window, I know it's only a single note in a window. I'm going to actually hide the bulky header on top. Mm-hmm. I'm going to and make it actually more optimized for that kind of one note window type scenario.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do that on iPad, but then I hit the issue where if the user would now take that window and change it to full screen mode using the three dots at the top of the window. I would like to, of course, undo that, detect that, and say, now I want to see the whole window.
Yeah.
And I'm not getting notified as a developer that that's happened, nor can I actually ask when this happens. And so, or what kind of window I'm in. And so, that's a shame because it means, that you have just a less nice user experience. And there's a range of those kind of things that as a user you might not see, but as a developer it's very obvious that there is kind of missing functionality there that would be great to have because I can make a better app if I have that information.
Yeah, I really hope they add this kind of stuff with the next Stage Manager update. Hopefully later this year in the summer or even sooner. That'd be nice.
Yeah, I'm very curious where they will take it. In general, these directions and that where does the iPad go? Which are they pushing to one end to the other end? Are they just adding more options? Are they? Yeah. When is the opinion kind of when do they dare to do an opinionated change of direction. That's always the big questions around the middle of the year, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it sometimes morphs throughout the summer as I get feedback.
My main gripe is still, and actually it prevents me from using my iPad more than I want. I was starting saying that I always fight with my kids, but I still can't wait for them to add decent account management. Where it's just so frustrating to have an iPad that is kind of partially locked down that my kids use,
right?
Where it couldn't just switch to my account when I just put my finger on the touch ID.
Yeah, the accounts thing. I would love some way to have different faces, and it unlocks depending on who
exactly.
That stuff should be there.
It's so obvious, and that would definitely make me use my iPad a lot more, because now I'm often hitting these kind of I have to disable screen time
yes
or other things, and it's like crazy, you quickly get to never mind, I'll just walk over to my Mac or something. But that's also because I mainly work from home, so on the road it's a bit different, and you have your own iPad,
right?
It feels, a really missing part that I would love to see happen.
Yeah. On the Mac, you guys introduced a formatting palette window, like a toolbar window type thing. And I'd imagine, I've never seen this on iPad. I love these toolbar palettes, these floating windows associated with the main app. Is that something just impossible to have an associated window that talks to a different window in that way?
It's not impossible, because that's what I mentioned with the tag browser. You can open that in a window, and then if you select a tag, you could say, show me the notes for this tag in the other scene. So it can be done. It's not really, I don't think a scene is really meant to be this kind of a palette window, basically.
Right, having a floating window where I select bold on the floating window and it talks to your main note window would be inelegant on iPad.
It would be harder, and probably you would, if I would go about and implement it, I would rather say have the actual window contain a view that's hovering on top, and so basically limit it to within the bounds of that window, instead of saying it's really a floating window that you can place anywhere. But I mean, that's an interesting thing, because that's why we went for the keyboard bar. I mean, then that's again one of these things where you see the iPad evolve, where at first it makes total sense, but now you have a situation where you actually do have a hardware keyboard. You then still need that bar at the bottom.
Yeah.
And so that's where it's sometimes you have these kind of tensions, I would say. But I agree, it would be nice to have those kind of windows as well. Basically, what on the Mac, I think they call them auxiliary windows or something, helper windows.
Yeah.
And so you could see that work well on iPad too.
Yeah, especially I can imagine a scenario external monitor. You have your main window on external monitor, and you have all your little palette tool windows on the iPad screen where you're just tapping the palettes, and then working on the external keyboard mouse. That could be interesting.
It's almost like, although that seems to go nowhere, but the touch bar above the keyboard
exactly.
on the Mac.
Yeah.
So you have this. And actually, I find that interesting too, because even on the Mac where we introduced this palette, effectively, what I did there was take the code from the keyboard bar on iPad, which is already kind of supposed to deal with, depending on which note you have a single instance, and depending on which note you're working in, it will affect that one. That now, because I went on Mac, I needed that same kind of approach. If you have a single little palette, then it should work on whichever note you're currently editing in. So I basically almost threw away the code I had on a Mac and took that keyboard bar, but just made it in the form of a window. So it's true that it's just a different appearance, but effectively the same thing.
Yeah. And on the Mac, there's the same way you get into new windows on iPad carries over the Mac. There's a button on each note, and the little triple dot thing has an option to open a new window. Is it drag and drop? Does that exist on the Mac, or are there different ways on the Mac that you open new windows?
No, on the Mac, well, there are some more. You rely more on like modifier keys. So if I hold, I think Command and then double click the header of the note, it will also do it. And there's a bunch of these kind of more Mac-like shortcuts.
Yeah.
But drag and drop doesn't really work because it doesn't have the concept of dragging something to the edge of the screen and then making it large. And also doesn't support that kind of transition easily. I'm sure you could hack it together probably if you would detect that it gets near the end, but that's a lot of I don't think it's so intuitive either. I mean, this is the model that Apple has made work on iPad and then uses in its own apps, and that's how people learn what can be done and what's kind of the way it should be done. And in general, if you port the behavior on one platform to the other, it doesn't always get used a lot, but because they simply don't expect it to work like that. Like the classic one is, I think, double tap. You know, like on the Mac, you do so many things with double clicking,
right?
But
and there's no double tapping, so it's like,
and you know, double tap. Okay, people can use it, and there are some. It's supported in some places in Agenda, but in general, people are not going to try to instinctively try double tapping to do something.
Right.
Like most things, and on the Mac, double clicking is kind of the first thing you would try on something. So
because on iPad, there's no hover with the finger. So like, you click, of course it's gonna, many instances do what a double click would do, or I guess not. I don't know.
And it's also, and even the hover, indeed, it's also, it's much harder to discover when something is you know, clickable, because on the Mac it instantly turns color when you move over it. You're like, oh wait, this is something I can interact with.
They need to introduce little things you can put on your fingertips, or it can just recognize when you're hovering with your fingers, like it could Apple Pencil to like the hover.
And that makes the iPad not always easy because you have these different modes, right? So, for instance, the classic one is the sidebar is I think it's 44 pixels for each item, which makes it much more spacious than on the Mac. But if people are using a pointer, a trackpad, or an Apple Pencil, then you could easily have the same kind of density of information. But because you don't know whether somebody's going to use it with his finger or with with the pencil, it feels still very, large for relatively speaking, the sidebar compared to the Mac, for instance. And so, those are the trade-offs that you have to deal with on iPad more than on the Mac, where you're like, well, people are going to use, they're going to use their mouse, so it doesn't need, this is the resolution that they can point at things with. And so it will be also in that sense very interesting if Apple ever does a touchscreen Mac, whether then it makes it even more like iPad and Mac coming together, right?
So another tweak to Agenda with version 17, and it's the business model. And a while ago, so the app started with this very awesome way of getting premium features, where you buy the premium features, you get 12 months worth of updates, you keep those. If you want more premium features, you buy another round of 12 months. And then I believe last year you guys introduced a subscription, which gives you a discount over the that method of just updating when you want the new features. And same thing with when you cancel the subscription, you keep the features from up until you paid. You've tweaked this model, and kind of what's the new model, and how did you guys go about this?
Yeah, so we made two changes. Drew and I, we're basically two people, and ultimately it means that you have to come up with a business model that it gives you the flexibility to pick business models the way you feel is fair. At the same time, you also you have to make a living being able to keep supporting Agenda, right? So this is the balance you're playing with. And so from the very start, we said, okay, we don't like subscriptions. That's what we said. And that's why we came up with this model that wasn't an auto-renewing subscription in the beginning, that you described. And then we, in a way, realized, well, our problem wasn't so much with subscriptions, it's with the fact that a subscription can hold you hostage effectively, right?
Yes.
In the sense that it's often it's subscription, but most of the time it's actually rental because you get the features as long as you pay.
Yeah.
And then they use that as a kind of hostage over you to say, hey, if you stop paying and then you lose everything, bye. So you're kind of like, okay, if I want to hold, if I want to keep using this, then I have to stay paying. And that's the part that we really didn't like. So because what we realized is actually this model that you describe, we got unanimous feedback that people love it. They find it indeed much fairer. And yeah, it works for us, except that what we started getting as a feedback from really good friends to say, oh, well, I use your app. But, actually, we never get reminded to actually pay. And so we had friends that were using the app and still using the app, but basically they did that round that you described maybe once or twice.
Yeah.
And then like, well, if I have to do this every year, it's a hassle, and it's and you never remind me. So there was people that simply didn't pay anymore. And at the end of the day, that's bad for the app because if we don't get enough income, we're forced to do something else. And so that's why we decided, okay, let's make at least this auto-renewing aspect. That's not what we have a problem with, because what our model is that if you stop paying, you will keep everything that you have bought up to that point. So,
if you wanted to, you could subscribe, cancel, and subscribe again when you want the new features.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and that's fine. But we wanted certainly to address those people that say, "Hey, I want to pay." But I've stopped doing it because I don't feel like putting my having to be reminded every year, etc. And so that's why. And the other thing was that it's different from what most apps do. So it's still not that easy to explain to people. Certainly the aspect of, okay, you buy what's there now, so all these features that are there, you will get them. You can keep them forever, and then you even get 12 months of features in the next 12 months that we release. People started like, how does this work and everything? And then you start realizing, and that's also why we made that last change to say, well, essentially this is just a subscription, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's how a yearly subscription works, because we only offer a yearly subscription. Right. You pay what's there now. And the subscription lasts a year, so obviously everything that comes in that year is yours, right?
Yes.
So that makes it nothing actually different. The only difference is that it automatically renews. But like you say, if you buy a subscription and you cancel it, because you're not sure yet whether next year you want to continue paying for it, and that's fine, and you keep everything in it, and nothing is different from how it worked. It's just simpler to explain. Because it's just a subscription where if you cancel, you keep everything that you have. That's effectively how it works.
And that makes total sense. And the move to that versus just the pay, and hopefully they remember the pay again to get new
also
features.
And the other big thing for us was that we got quite a few people asking, I'd like to try the features. And so that was one thing that we couldn't do, because once you give them away, you couldn't then retake them and managing that, because Apple has the trial set up, but it's all tied to subscriptions.
Right.
And so now it actually works this way, and you can try for 7 days, see, and if you cancel, then you won't get charged. And that's the idea, right? So in fact, every subscription starts as a trial. So you always get this first 7 days. Is this actually what I was looking for? Which we also liked, and helps us also convince people to try it out first. And then the other thing we did is to say, well, if you don't like subscriptions, is there a way how you can avoid them? And that's why we now also introduced this lifetime premium option. So you can also say, well, I'm going to just buy once. And of course, it's more expensive, but then basically you will get everything in the future without paying ever again, which starts to pay off, I think, after effectively the equivalent of a 3-year subscription. So
how hard was it to decide that price point for the lifetime to balance? We don't want everyone, or maybe you do. You probably don't want everyone doing lifetime. Otherwise, you're going to have to continually try to get new customers so you continue to have revenue.
it's a discussion where you say, oh, what do we think is fair? Like you say, it doesn't make sense to say, well, it's the equivalent of 2 years, but I think it's in the order of 3.5 or 4 years.
Okay.
3.5 years, I think.
Yeah.
In between 3 and 4. And so to us that felt fair. It's you've been long enough with us, and you've been supporting us, and you've basically been the equivalent of 3 times renewing, or and so it feels that that's a fair point where you can say, at this point, we're happy to to give you the rest for free for as long as we are making this app and as long as you are using the app, and that it's a little bit gut feeling effectively, let's be honest. But it felt like a good point. Yeah.
And one of the other big changes is moving to a single subscription that's iOS and Mac, which makes sense to me, even though I'm iPad only, because as you mentioned, the multi-window support, it spawned from a desire on the Mac, and it's like, oh, this also works on iPad. So development work on one platform directly affects the other. But was it hard to make that decision to make it a single versus the dual?
Well, it's funny how these things go, because you get all these between Drew and me, we discuss all these things, are the options, are we going to stick with it, and there was certainly a desire to simplify things. I think it was largely driven this as well. Like I said, people going to getting confused by what does it mean? Is this a subscription? Is it not a subscription? It's kind of it sounds like a subscription, but you say it's not, and so there's all these kind of discussions, and you start every time going one step back and say, but should we then actually still have this kind of discrimination between iOS and only and Mac and iOS, and even that is a confusing thing. And what we noticed is that first, so on the Mac there is only one. We felt that there was always on the Mac, if you bought it, it would include iOS as well. So there was on the Mac there was only one option, but on iOS we felt like, well, if somebody's only using it on an iPhone, then it's a pretty steep price point. Right. So that's why we decided to have this split. On iOS you could choose. But what we saw there is that there were quite a few people, a lot of people actually, that bought it first on iOS and then came back to us and say, can I add the Mac now as well? So that was one thing that we noticed. And actually some people then got frustrated that it didn't include it, or there was also confusion there. But when we started thinking about it, we also said, well, it's actually a little bit unfair that if you have, say, an iPhone and an iPad, that for $14 or something, you would be the equivalent of $40 if somebody has a Mac and an iPhone. Well, the iPad is becoming so Mac-like. Yes. That it's, and in fact, if you then start digging into the numbers, you actually see that those people that really use Agenda the way it's kind of meant is that on iPad, and that don't have a Mac usually are an iPad. So it feels like the iOS, the iPhone is really a companion. It's great for lookup, but realistically, you're not going to sit there, take huge notes during a meeting on an iPhone, I think. And so we said, okay,
it's interesting because the iPhone is the companion, and there's no way to say have an iPad subscription versus an iPhone only subscription. So that would be interesting, like to have iPad and iOS or Mac and iOS. But
so I think originally we kind of saw this kind of the scenario we had in mind when we started was like, okay, you have a Mac and you have an iPhone, but what if somebody only has an iPhone? And then he said, like, well, but those should get it cheaper. But in the meantime, two things happen. You start realizing, like, is somebody who really only has a single iPhone really our target user? Because it's great to keep note-taking, but is it realistic that that person sees the value so much that he's willing to pay prices for the premium features, etc., which are anyway less effective on iPhone in a way than on a Mac or an iPad? And then you say, okay, so that's one thing. Is that will those people even really pay if they only use Agenda only on the iPhone? And then because iPhone and iPad iOS and iPad OS are kind of the same app, without you realizing, you give people the opportunity to say, oh, if I have only an iPhone and I have an iPad, then I still can take the lower price point
Yes.
of the iPhone and get everything there. And so we didn't think that was fair to compare to an iPhone and a Mac, which is effectively the same combination. So
Yeah.
it's like you start getting into this discussion, you start looking at who is really buying the app, for who really sees the value. Well, the people that really see the value either have a Mac or an iPad.
Yes.
And then usually in combination with an iPhone. And then you say, like, let's simplify it. Like, these people that have a Mac or an iPad will see the value of the app. Also, they will see the value, be it because of the features, or even be it because they want to support us as a small independent team that builds this app that you use every day. And I want to make sure that team stays around, being able to focus on it. So that's also one of the reasons why I introduced a lifetime pack, because we see a lot of people mainly from that kind of background coming to us. Like I want to make sure that you guys keep on working on it. And we said, let's just simplify it in a way and make it a single thing. Don't worry about Mac or iOS, because in practice, almost everybody has both anyway. So
right. So makes sense.
Let's make it simpler.
Yeah. Well, anything we didn't touch on or cover that you'd like to before we wrap it up?
No. I think we've discussed a lot already. But I'm curious how, like you say, the type of thing that intrigues me is how the Mac and the iPad will continue to coexist, how they will coexist, and as a developer also the overlap and the differences that will steer a lot of how we have to develop our agenda in the future as well.
And different form factors.
I hope
iPad may be getting bigger as well soon, so we'll see how that affects things.
Yeah, and I certainly hope that Apple, as they come closer, that it will, that they will choose to make it also more open to developers rather than closed, which is always our biggest pet peeve. We came from, the Mac gradually gets a bit closed down in some places. But the iPad should come from the other side and should open up, and I really hope that Apple adds those, more of those kind of features behind that the user doesn't see, but that gives us more power in a way to decide, okay, we can optimize the user experience here because we know where your cursor is on the screen, for instance, or we know in which kind of window you are, so that we can have more control over the user experience. That's how I hope Apple will add in the future.
Absolutely, yeah. So, where can people find more information about Agenda?
The easiest way is to go to agenda.com, our website. So from there you find the links to on whichever platform you are to the App Store, and find all the information as well. And then we also have the community. So that's agenda.community, which is where all users are, and where we place all articles on how to use it, and where you can keep up to date, where you can discuss and ask questions to other users, how to get started, and these kind of things.
Excellent. Yeah. And then, free to download. And then there's now a 7-day trial if you want to try out all the premium stuff that I've been really enjoying. Because you guys have been adding to it year after year, and it's some good stuff in there at this point.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, we started this in 2018, and we're still going through the list of things that were already features then that we wanted to see and that others wanted to see, and we keep on cracking on. I mean, Drew is already working on adding passwords, the possibility to add passwords to your notes. So again, with the kids in mind, or curious colleagues or anything. But that's another one, and there's a whole series of these kind of things that we still will keep on going through. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Alex, for your time. I really do appreciate it.
You're welcome, Tim. It's a pleasure.
Well, that was my interview with Alex. Learn more at www.agenda.com. My thanks to Alex for his time recording this episode, and my thanks to you for your time and attention tuning in. You can support this podcast over at patreon.com/iPadPros or by subscribing in Apple Podcasts. With that, I'll talk to everyone again real soon.